The 7 scariest Dogman stories of summer 2022. 7 freaky, creepy, and allegedly true accounts of how the Dogman spent his summer. Now let's kick it all off with this brand new story that I know for a fact you've never heard before. This one scared me, and I hope you like it as much as I do. We're gonna call it the 1 a.m. train out of Montauk. Dear Scary Stories NYC, before I get started with this story of my cryptid encounter with a dog-headed fur-covered entity way back in the day, I would like to give a shout out to modern technology. If I had a cell phone with me during the Dogman thing that happened, it literally would have had to happen in a very different way. In fact, things like this never seem to happen any longer, almost as though the creatures themselves understand what our little glowing devices can do. And that would have to be impossible since I don't even know how to operate any of them. At any rate, this story happened to me long before I ever owned a cell phone. There are none of them mentioned from start to finish. I think we might have had VHS and beta back then, but the internet was something that connected slowly and loudly, and then sent you a bill for $300. Actually, I think this was before even that. Come to think of it, this would have had to have still been in the 1980s, not the 90s as I was first thinking. So anyway, this was a long time ago, and it took place in a location that I've never personally heard of any Dogman stories coming from. If you know of any, please tell us about them in the comments. I'm talking about the far tip of Long Island in New York. I'm referring to Montauk Point. I've read random accounts of high strangeness out in Long Island. John Keel wrote of a woman seeing something not unlike a Bigfoot out there. And of course most people have heard the rumors and legends surrounding Montauk, not to mention the photos of the Montauk Monster. I'm one of the few people who've had to deal with a werewolf or dogman on Long Island, but it's not impossible to encounter them, especially as you get further out away from the city. I want to define my terms so that we're all talking about the same thing. I don't really know if this creature was a shapeshifter, as in a Lon Chaney Hollywood movie style werewolf or wolfman. The only shapeshifters I've been made aware of in nature change in one direction. The caterpillar becomes the butterfly. It doesn't go out as a butterfly then turn back into a caterpillar as it crawls home to sleep it off. So I personally think those werewolf legends and films and shows were really probably talking about something else entirely different than real-life werewolf stories talk about. Like those might have been cautionary tales about addiction or out-of-control emotions or rage or coming of age, with the transformation into an animal meant more symbolically than literally. If the thing I saw had transformed from something else, I think it was a one-way transformation. If he used to be an ordinary wolf or dog or even a human being, it didn't matter in the current moment. He was now a dogman, and even if I referred to him as a werewolf or wolfman, as I told you what happened, you should know that in this context, I mean to use the words interchangeably. Now, at the time when this all happened to me, I was living in Montana. If you live on the western side of our great state, you find yourself arguably within driving distance of 10 or more national forests, national parks, and protected wildernesses. So, in which of these did I see the Dogman? Well, in my case it was a little more complicated than that. I was spending a day hiking, well, more like walking around really, in the mountainous Lolo National Forest, south of the Flathead Reservation. I was hot and sweating, wearing a t-shirt and jeans, having wished I were wearing shorts instead. I'd experienced the passing of a loved one fairly recently, and I wanted to find the peak that she and I had once stood on together. It was very frustrating, but then a cool breeze made me feel a little less overheated, and also helped me feel a new sense of optimism and hope. The next thing I knew, though, it was nighttime, and I was in an area surrounded on all sides by water. The cool breeze blew a little harder now and whistled or even moaned in this new dark place. I felt like I was in Innsmouth in some Lovecraft story. I felt as though I were on an outcropping of land somewhere up in New England. I wondered if it were really night, or if it was the storm that had darkened the scene. I remember standing on a road passing over water. Technically it was a bridge, but I don't remember anything bridgy about it. I don't even remember rails along the sides of the road. I do remember it being autumn or winter, because all the trees were at least turned orange or brown or yellow, if they hadn't already lost their leaves entirely. The wind was whipping the water on either side of the road, causing big foamy waves to spill over onto the edges of the street itself. Now, my t-shirt and jeans and sneakers were soaked, and I wished I had somewhere inside I could run to. I remember looking northward, or what I hoped was northward, and noticing that the body of water I was viewing was somewhat small and shaped like a triangle. The bridge road I was standing on was the bottom of the triangle. What I didn't notice at the time, and find hard not to notice now, is how much the rest of the water to the south resembles the shape of an elephant. Both the triangle and the elephant remind me of the treasure hunting TV show called The Curse of Oak Island. Everyone I know got rid of cable years ago, so I don't know if they ever continued that show into the pandemic or not, but it sure used to be good. Anyway, I'm not saying the Dogman is hiding a biblical treasure on Montauk Island. I'm just saying that I found myself on that industrial road that cuts the triangle off from the elephant. That's all I'm saying. My choices were to run away from the woods, run toward the woods, or dive into the water on one side or the other. I heard what sounded like a railroad train, and I decided that if I walked toward the woods and then to my left, I might stand a good chance of running into that train station, and then I could at least know where I was. So I did just that. I walked toward the woods, then to my left, dripping wet and being rained on unmercifully. At some point it sort of let up to about 30% of what it had been, almost like the super lowered my water pressure with no warning. In this case it was welcome though, as it made walking a little less terrible. As I wiped the rain off my face over and over, I began to think I was hearing someone in the woods, walking just out of my view. A shiver went up and down my spine, as my first thought was that it must be a killer or a psychopath from the TV or something. I stopped walking, hoping to hear the footsteps head off ahead of me. I waited to give them a good long head start. Instead, I heard nothing, except the continual rain drizzling down. I stood there listening, getting tickled by the water running down all over me, and eventually decided that I must have been imagining stuff. I started walking again, and this time I didn't hear anything walking along with me. Still, I was feeling utterly creeped out, and I decided to walk a little faster, almost jogging really. All of a sudden, I stopped short when I heard a kind of a sneeze in the woods. Not only had the sound come from the woods, but it came from the same spot I thought I had heard someone stalking me last. Whoever it was sneezed again, and I realized the kind of sneeze I was hearing. It was the kind of sneeze that your big old giant family dog makes when he comes in after spending too much time in the rain. Ah, it was only a dog. I have no fear of canines, so I called out to the creature, wherever he was, sneezing alone in the woods. I said aloud that if he felt lonely, he could walk along with me to the train station. And then I saw tree branches part, and I saw a very tall man wearing what appeared to be animal furs, walking out onto the road. No, I saw almost instantly I was wrong. This was not a man. It was something more like a bear man, or a dog man. It wasn't walking around like a dog, it was walking around like a human. And yet, this was not a guy in a furry costume. The shape of the legs and the skull were not something you could even wear as a costume. You wouldn't have been able to put any living man's legs into an outfit that was shaped like what I saw. Now, I did not know at the time that when he was walking through those trees, he was walking out of a cemetery. But I swear to you that he was holding something with one hand and biting chunks out of it. I didn't see clearly enough what it was, but in my opinion, I believe that the werewolf man was gnawing on, well, I'm not even gonna say it. So I turned around and started walking more resolutely toward that train station off in the distance. I was a whole lot more determined about it, but I was trying to sort of look casual. You know, for the werewolf. I had stupidly invited him out to walk with me, so now I had to hope that he had been trained in how to heal. I felt like I lived through the end of the world 17 times that night, just walking that long road toward the station. Each time I turned around, the Dogman stopped and stared at me, expectantly. It kept the same amount of distance between us at all times, something like 35 to 45 feet. That didn't stop me from shaking, I'll tell you. If you're nervous about anything in your life, go and meet a Dogman. Then you'll really know what being scared is all about. There was a little pamphlet blowing around in the breeze that I stepped on and picked up. It was a train schedule, and it told me where I was. I was in Montauk, and my means of escape was right in front of me. According to the schedule I was reading, I needed to catch the next train, coming any minute, which was the 1 a.m. train. The closer I got to the station, the more my footsteps seemed to echo. I couldn't really tell if I was being followed anymore or not. The ticket booth was closed, which panicked me. I was not from there. I didn't know that you could pay for tickets while you were actually riding where you wanted to go. Where did I want to go, anyway? I had realized that might be an important question, but I hadn't thought of it until I could already hear the train coming into the station. Well, I wanted to get out of Montauk, that was for sure. I saw the word Pennsylvania somewhere, and even in my foggy mental state, I knew Pennsylvania was a long distance from Montauk, New York. When I got on the train and the man asked me for my ticket, I asked him how much it cost to go to Pennsylvania. He laughed and sold me a ticket to Pennsylvania Station, which is actually a place in Manhattan. It was only like an hour before sunrise the time I got above ground and started walking around on the sidewalks. And I have to say that was the one upside of this horrible and bizarre experience. I was in New York City just before the sun came up. I had no luggage or anything to carry around with me, and so this Montana boy just got to walk around, watching the light change on these giant buildings they have over there. Sometimes I'd sip hot coffee and watch the colors of the city continually modify themselves as the entire place seemed to stretch and wake up. What a blessing to be alone, to be allowed to be just whoever I was, wherever I was. Once the sun was up, however, my parents were going to be up too. And once my parents were up, I was going to have to call them and let them know I was still alive. That part would be hard enough, but explaining that I was on the East Coast and needed them to wire me money if I was going to be able to get back to Montana proved to be something they never really forgave me for. My father told me years later, when he was about to leave us, that he didn't care so much about the money it took to get me home. It was the fact that I would even think to pull a stunt like that, flying to the other side of the country without telling anybody and with no return trip planned. That was the part that left him feeling so slapped in the face. Neither he nor my mother ever accepted my story that I was abducted or transported and brought to the East Coast against my will, where a werewolf chased me through the storm to the rail station. Their faces would reflect such disappointment in me each time I tried to tell them the truth. The more I would try to explain, the more certain they were that I had lost my mind. Well, my mother called it mental illness, but my father told me and her both that my problem was a basic lack of a moral center and a lack of a backbone to allow me to stand up and behave like an adult. My mother felt my nervous system was diseased, while Dad viewed my morality and my soul as sickening and decayed. The sighting of this dogman or werewolf and my subsequent reaction to it eventually got me almost entirely removed from my parents' will. Since I have no brothers or sisters, they left the bulk of their estate to an organization pledged to aiding young people with severe emotional problems. Even with his dying act, my dad slapped me in the face and slapped my reputation down in front of the world. Rather than leave me enough to live on, Dad left the money to a mental health clinic in sympathy with other disappointed parents. At any rate, I think the worst mental illness is self-importance, and I don't mind working for my daily bread. So I had been in the Lolo out in Montana, and then the next thing I remembered was being in Montauk, New York, at the end of Long Island, in the middle of a rainstorm, being chased by what looked to me like a werewolf. The Lolo National Park is 2,500 miles away from Montauk, okay? If I were to drive from one place to the other, it would take me 38 hours or more to do it. But I remember being in one location and then being in the other. And then I saw the Dogman, you know? I was in this strange nightmare situation, and then on top of that, I was being chased by what I would have thought was a mythical beast before I even understood where I was or how I'd gotten there. Now, even if I had intended to do that, even if it were my goal to personally shame my parents, please answer me this. How? How did I even do it? I don't know myself, but I bet I could find out. I just have to take a night trip out in the rain and interview all the riders on the 1 a.m. from Montauk. $7 PayPal member, and on PayPal, let's remember, your donation goes through right away, thanks to Matthew Frederick every day. There are lots of ways to keep this channel going, but two of our favorites are to either become recurring PayPal Club members at peterbernard.com, the way Matthew Frederick has done, or to make a one-time donation at paypal.me/peterbernard209. Henry Lee Dogman will be along to explain that kind of thing all the way at the very end of this extra long special. But right now, let's jump into our second of 7 scariest Dogman stories of August 2022. And we call this one Dogman, the Horse Thief. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I once went to stay with my cousins in Kentucky, who lived on a ranch in the suburbs of Lexington. To me, it was a huge spread of land, and I imagine they were very rich. They laughed when I said things like that, and they'd inform me that their cattle ranch was a tiny one in the grand scheme of things. This was back when I was 17 or 18, so I guess we're talking about 1968 or 69. There was a horse who was kept in a small stable outside the house. That was the pet of the women of the house. That would be my 2 female cousins and their mom. The horse was called Diamond, which I assumed was because she had a diamond-shaped white spot on her nose, surrounded by her otherwise dark red-brown coat and long black mane. This was not a beast of burden. This was a luxury, but one that had been given to the family as a gift by one of the neighbors, who I suppose were all richer than my cousins, now that I think back on it. The youngest of the girls, Zoe, who I guess was 13 or 14 back then, ran into the house crying one evening that there was a monster trying to attack Diamond. Obviously, no matter how crazy that sounded, My male cousins and I still all got up. I ran outside to see what was actually happening, that Zoe translated into or interpreted as a monster attack. Well, there wasn't any attacker, monster or otherwise, but the horse was pretty shaken up, so none of us doubted Zoe that something had happened or almost happened out at the barn. We all gathered around to hear the girl's story, which went like this. Zoe was walking out to check in on Diamond and brush her hair. As she got closer to the stable, she saw a large man leaning into the stall where the horse was. Zoe said she called out, asking who that was over there. The man pulled back out of the stall and turned to look at Zoe directly. She said he had eyes like fire, and he had to have been a monster, something that worked for the devil. She seemed amazed that the horse was not hurt in any way, as she was convinced that the demonic monstrosity would have cut or burnt her badly before we could have even gotten out there. Still, we could find no footprints of anything that wasn't wearing boots or shoes around the entrance of that little horse house, so nobody really knew what to make of any of this. Zoe announced that she was going to sleep in her sleeping bag near Diamond that night, and I volunteered to stay with her if someone could lend me their sleeping bag. This way she could protect the horse, and I could protect her. Zoe had wanted one of her brothers or sisters to volunteer, but apparently Zoe had developed a bit of a reputation for crying wolf and over-dramatizing events, so her siblings were more than happy to let me guard her instead. It became a moot point when her mother forbade her from sleeping anywhere except her bed. At least I had thought that would be the end of it. Sometime deep into the night, like 2 or 3 a.m., there came a blood-curdling scream from outside my window. I had been dreaming, so I woke up completely confused and turned around. Had that scream really happened, or did I dream it? Well, it happened again, and this time I leaped out of bed, and I ran outside to see whatever I could see. Well, Zoe ran into me as I ran out the back door, and we both came tumbling back into the house. She was shouting that the monster was back, and I ran outside past her because I really wanted to see this thing for myself. I wondered what it would turn out to actually be that was out there, and I was kind of stunned when I saw what looked like a werewolf bolt away from the horse stalls on 2 legs. It was clearly not a man, however, even just going by his silhouette. He was too tall to be a man, for one thing, and he ran in such a way that a human wouldn't ever do it. The legs it ran on were shaped differently, looking more like the rear legs of a large canine. And the way it ran, however, was not like a dog or wolf or human or any other living being that I'd ever witnessed. I was mocked by my cousins because I was from the city, and so what would I know about how animals walked or ran? Just as we had all doubted Zoe and guessed what she might really be seeing, so too now I was the one being doubted, and my family wondered what I had seen that I had misinterpreted as a werewolf. Zoe and I got together to compare notes. It was taller than her father, and her father was I think 6'3". It had a body something like a human except covered in fur like a dog. Its legs were like a canine's hind legs. Its head was not human at all, looking like a cross between a prehistoric dog and a prehistoric wolf. The head looked so large and heavy that I wasn't sure I could have even lifted it should it have fallen off the beast's broad, man-like shoulders. It was large like a bear, but it was fast-moving and wily, like a creature 1/3 its size. The 2 of us made plans to sneak out that night with our Instamatic flash camera and lay in wait for the dog-headed werewolf man. We were going to, in those innocent and primitive days, attempt to get photographic proof of the existence of the creature or monster or whatever it was. Zoe was doing it to convince the others that the danger was real, in order to protect her horse, Diamond. To an extent I was too, but I was also very interested in getting a flash photo of the beast, just so that I myself could see it better. I really couldn't understand what that thing was, and I wanted to know pretty badly. I kept having dreams about it where I would understand what it was finally. There would be such a sense of relief and excitement as I found out what the creature was. I always felt like the answer was so obvious. I almost wanted to laugh at how simple the explanation was. The trouble was, as I would wake up, I would forget the answer and realize that it had all just been a dream. In waking life, the dog-headed man was even more of a mystery than he was in my dream life. So before I go on, do you all know what a Polaroid instant camera was? Back in those days before digital cameras, you would shoot images onto film and then take them somewhere like a drugstore to have them all developed. It cost money and it took time. The other option, which had been around since the 50s at least, was to buy yourself a Polaroid instant camera, which would shoot the image onto a little square thing. You'd pull the little white square out of the bottom of the camera and wait a few minutes while the image developed on it in front of your eyes. There was no film. There was no film negative. That little white rectangle that your image appeared on was the photo, and that was the only copy of it that was ever going to exist. So these Polaroid cameras had their disadvantages, but they had the advantage of being ready to view in only a few minutes. Now obviously they don't make these cameras any longer since digital photos are all much more instant than the instant cameras of old. To me and Zoe, back there in 1968 or 69 though, we felt we were armed with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment when we had that old Polaroid hanging around our neck. So once we both snuck out and regrouped on the side of the stable invisible from the house, we realized that we didn't really have a plan. She did bring her sleeping bag and I did borrow one of her brother's, but I didn't really feel comfortable with the idea of sticking my legs down into that thing. If the dog-headed werewolf man jumped out at us, I might be too busy unzipping the sleeping bag to get away in time. During the sunlit hours, it had all seemed so simple. Wait till the werewolf man came out to mess with the horse, then snap a flash photo. End of story. Dogman is proven to be real. But once we were out there in the middle of the night, it didn't seem that simple. Even if we got a photo, it wasn't like that would make the dogman disappear or collapse unconscious. If the dogman showed up, we were going to be in danger. It wouldn't matter if we got a photo of him if we lost our lives in the process. At least, it wouldn't matter to the two of us. So we unzipped our sleeping bags and used them more like covers as we sat there leaning against the wall of the horse's home. We both awoke with the sound of Diamond the horse whinnying and thundering out of her stall. She was not alone. She was being ridden bareback by an immense form that she was unable to throw off of her back. Zoe screamed and ran around the back of the stalls. She was the one who had the camera, so I hoped she was planning on sneaking around the other side and getting a nice little Polaroid to prove our case. As I watched, the two animals battled for dominance. Diamond ran in a circle, rearing up on her hind legs, then throwing herself onto her two front legs as she raised her hind quarters up in the air. Still, her rider held on, its hands grabbing her mane, sometimes her neck at others. The humanoid form's knees and lower legs held tight to the horse's back, giving easily with the movement of his mount. The humanoid only gripped the horse hard when he needed to, and kept as light a touch as possible without allowing himself to be thrown. Even before I caught his silhouette briefly, I knew it was the dog-headed man who was riding Diamond. That beast could probably run as fast as Diamond under his own power, so why would he even want to ride a horse? Was he doing it for the sheer joy of doing it? Was the dogman just a horse lover like Zoe, her sister, and her mom? All I know is that the two of them, Diamond and her new master, took off running out into the night. Zoe was there suddenly, crying as her horse disappeared into the darkness. I asked her if she got a photo, and she told me to stop picking on her. I took that as a no. So the next day, everyone finally believed us, as the horse was no longer there. We all got into 3 vehicles and began driving around the area, looking for the horse, and asking people we passed if they had seen either the horse or the dogman. nobody had. We were seriously bummed out when we drove back to the family farm, but when we got there, Diamond was back in her stall. The ladies celebrated while the guys looked for prints from the creature, finding none. Of course, the discussion that night was what kind of higher security enclosure the horse needed, and how much it would cost them to construct it. The rest of the time I was out there that year, I helped them with that project, but it didn't matter, because the Dogman never came back. I guess he only wanted to steal Diamond for a joyride. I can think of nary a person as nice as Mary. Her kindness helps us pay the billies. Of course, I mean dear Mary Gillies. Please join me in thanking today's executive producer, Mary Gillies, for making this episode possible. Mary has been a PayPal Club member at our $7 a month level for years, and we could not have made it this far without her. Thank you so much, Mary Gillies. Did my uncle really box a Dogman? Dear Scary Stories NYC, I don't know if this would be useful for your channel or not, but I used to have a crazy Uncle Laszlo who told us stories about fighting these humanoid animals that I think might have actually been dogmen. I mean, he never called them that. I don't think he knew the word dogman. But in retrospect, it seems to both me and my younger brother, this might have been what he was talking about. I'm not going to say that my uncle never exaggerated. In fact, he had a reputation for wild stories. But the fact remains that he never used the word dogman to describe what he fought, and he never tried to get any publicity drawn to himself because of these old stories he'd tell. It seemed like something he actually wanted to keep hushed up because, well, let me just tell it to you in order of how I think it happened, and then you can sort of hopefully see my point. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing a guy would have made up, not even my crazy uncle. Now, my uncle was stationed in Australia during his time in the service. This would have been back in the 80s or 90s, I guess. And that was where he became involved in boxing kangaroos. I'm not sure if that's still legal these days or if it was legal back then either, but I know it was still happening. Maybe it's going on today, I wouldn't know. I raised the term of animal cruelty one time to my uncle, and he said it was more like human cruelty, because the kangaroos won as often as they didn't. Regardless of any of that, it was when my uncle was back in Michigan, shortly after being discharged from the service, that he fell into an illegal underground fight club scene, in which he claimed he was sent into the ring to fight this American kind of kangaroo. It was sort of a mix between a wolf and a roo. It didn't jump around. It walked upright on its hind legs. And not only did they have boxing gloves on these particular animals, they had muzzles on their long snouts as well. These were more like upright walking canines than kangaroos. But they were about the same size as the roos, and there was a pretty heavy underground following for watching their fights and betting on the same. Uncle Laszlo told us that this was run by organized crime and he never had any idea what the animals he fought were, or where the mob managed to capture them. Since he had just gotten out of the service and was introduced to this line of illegal work by some of his buddies from his tour of duty, he assumed these were foreign exotic animals shipped into the United States. In fact, he had a sort of presumption that they came from the Middle East and were discovered during one of the conflicts that the U.S. got itself involved with over there toward the end of the last century. I'm of the opinion that the beasts were probably captured right there in Michigan, the same state the fights took place in. If they were imported from anywhere, it was probably from across the border up in Canada. I think those were dogmen, and everyone knows that dogmen come from the Midwest. And the mob of that day simply imported them into Detroit itself, where they were kept in captivity and used to fight humans in the boxing ring for people to bet on. Apparently there was a huge underground racket for watching these fights. Now, I have no idea how they put boxing gloves on kangaroos before they put them in the boxing ring, so I certainly have no idea how a Dogman can be fitted with the same. I once asked Uncle Laszlo how it was done, and he only got annoyed at me. I took that to mean that he didn't know how they did it either. My guess would be that they put some kind of knockout drug in the Dogman's food, then waited till he was asleep to tie the gloves and booties onto him, because these Dogmen, or American kangaroos as my Uncle Laszlo used to call them, had claws on their hands and claws on their feet, both of which needed to be covered and heavily padded in order to prevent them from ripping apart their human opponents, not to mention the referees and probably half the audience. Uncle Laszlo said the American kangaroos were far more vicious than the Australian ones, and they were significantly harder to beat in the ring as well. According to my uncle, the creatures were about the same size as the men, around 6 feet, but they had ears up on top of their heads, which gave them the illusion of a height advantage. They tended to fight in a manic way in the early rounds, but if they didn't score an early knockout, you could often outlast them and win in later rounds. The creatures seemed built for shorter bursts of speed, while Laszlo claimed to be one of those slow and steady wins the race kinds of fighters. He told us he'd be on defense for at least the first 3 rounds against these creatures that I think were Dogmen. His plan, or really his coach's plan which he chose to follow, was to let the creature tire itself out, then try to win the fight on points. He never succeeded in knocking any of them out, although he did tell us he'd had his block knocked off more than once by one of them. That's kind of the part of it that makes me wonder if this all might have been for real. I mean, if he was making it all up, wouldn't he have told us that he won? That he beat the Dogman up and knocked it out? It seems like if it was a fish tale, then he would have won in the ends of the stories. Instead, Uncle Laszlo always seemed to end these stories wide-eyed and shaking his head at the memories. One time I asked him whatever became of the people on that scene, and he told me nervously that he didn't want to know. When I asked him what he thought happened to the animals, he got visibly upset and told me that he didn't care as long as he never had to see any of them ever again. Even years afterward, he was quite shaken up by the memory of what he called the American kangaroos. Would he have been acting that way if these were just stories he made up to entertain his nephews? I asked Uncle Laszlo if he thought the fights were still going on, and if I could get to see one of them. He told me it was possible that the fights might still be happening, but he lost his connections to all that long ago. The reason he left the fights is that they got shut down quietly by the feds, with the heads of the operation disappearing suddenly. Maybe to federal prison, or maybe who knows where. That didn't mean that someone else might not have started it all up again somewhere else. Most likely someone with deep enough pockets to pay the feds off to keep it quiet. But Uncle Laszlo said the fights were so dangerous and so risky that it's also quite possible that they were never revived. There are so many simpler ways to make money, so many less risky and dangerous things to bet your money on. It might well have all disappeared into the black hole of history, never to return. Our uncle left us in 2016, sadly, with no way to answer any of these questions. There was no deathbed admission of lying about any of this. It's not like he ever renounced the stories. Then again, it's not like this was the subject of conversation too often toward the end either. This was considered trivial by Laszlo and the family, and to me, that also adds to the idea that it might have just been a collection of true anecdotes. Still, it's impossible to know another person's mind, so who can say if this is something that my uncle would have felt a reason to concoct? I mean, if he were alive today, with all the current popularity of the Dogman, maybe he would have had some motivation to tell made-up Dogman stories. But since he never heard of the Dogman, and never called the creatures either that, or werewolves, or wolfmen, or anything of that nature. I'm kinda left feeling as though he had no motivation to lie about any of this subject. Which only brings me back around full circle to asking the same question I asked to start this all off. And that question is, did my uncle really box a Dogman? Our executive producer is S.A. Rose. They're a PayPal Club member. I do suppose their donation came through just today, so we need to thank our dear S.A. Please join us in thanking S.A. Rose, a $7 PayPal Club member who joined up at peterbernard.com. S.A. gets to see our secret uncensored stories, of which we produce 4 per month, and also gains access to our over 24 hours of secret uncensored Dogman archives. Woodstock Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story for you that happened to me 10 or 11 years ago in Seven Bends State Park, right outside of Woodstock. Not Woodstock, New York, with the hippies and Jimi Hendrix playing the national anthem. I mean Woodstock, Virginia, which is located something like 100 miles west of Washington, D.C. This is a northern area in Virginia. In terms of Dogman locations, it's just to the west of Maryland, which does have a tradition of a Dogman called a Dwayyo, going back generations. It's just to the south of Pennsylvania, home of numerous Dogman and Bigfoot legends. And it's just to the east of West Virginia, home of the infamous Mothman. So although I had never personally heard of any local Dogman experiences until I had my own, it doesn't seem that far-fetched to me that one of the creatures might migrate through the area sometimes, or at least in some years. So in this area, the Shenandoah River flows along in about the bendiest configuration that you can imagine, flowing east and then west and then east, giving it this snake-like appearance when looked at overhead or in maps. You can understand why the area and the park there are both called Seven Bends. I had the intention of camping with a friend of mine we can call Jerry Lee in the Seven Bends State Park over there. I mean, we wanted to sneak off and camp in the woods, not in any official campsite located over there. We were into having a private time in those days, not wanting to be bothered by, older people. We wouldn't set any campfires because we didn't want to be noticed, and we'd survive off of trail mix and whatever we'd brought with us to drink that time. We were both taking undergraduate classes in Pittsburgh, and we'd camped in a couple of parks in Pennsylvania before we decided we wanted to see these Seven River Bends with our own eyes. I won't say that we weren't into cryptids at the time, but cryptids to us back then were sort of stories to tell each other in the dark to see which one of us was braver. I'm not sure if we believed that Bigfoot or anything like that was real back then. At least, I don't know if we believed in them once the sun was bright in the sky in the daytime. At night in the forest when you can't see anything, but you can hear everything, well, during those times it's hard for at least some part of your mind to start believing in just about everything that goes bump in the night. In that location, however, we kept hearing a kind of an animal noise that we couldn't place. It wasn't quite canine. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a raccoon, but it didn't seem human either. At points when it got briefly loud, it sounded like a crazy woman. So you can imagine how spooky that was. We had heard that some wildcats can sound like human women when they're under some kind of a stress or pain, so we wanted to know if there were supposed to be any of those kinds of cats in the woods around Woodstock. One of the days we wandered into the Woodstock Museum in town over there, hoping that someone could tell us what that animal was that we were hearing the night before. Now, that particular museum is a lot more about human culture than about animals, though. So we ended up getting caught up with a couple of the people who either worked or volunteered there, as they explained the history of that town, going back to when it was caught in the middle of the Civil War. It was so interesting to us that we lost track of time. By the time we realized we had to go, the sky was dark, and it looked like it was about to start raining. Jerry Lee and I beat it out of town, sort of jogging back to our campsite in the woods. We had set up camp in a relatively flat plain on a hillside, and Jerry was concerned that we might slip down the hill if the rains got too intense that night, or else we might experience a mudslide from further up the hill and get ourselves buried. When we got back, the rain hadn't started yet, but the sky had grown as dark as midnight. Once I got my eyeballs on that tent, I was ready to walk right up to it and pull it down. But Jerry Lee's arm blocked me from walking out of the woods and into the clearing. Ahead of us in the darkness, there was someone else walking around our tent. He looked like a big guy, but he was bent down low to look really closely at our tent. I wanted to call out to the guy and tell him to leave our stuff alone, but he looked so very tall, even when he was bent over like that. If he turned out to be a psycho, a guy that large might be able to take both me and Jerry Lee in a fight. So I kept my mouth shut, and I watched to see what the big guy might do next. Well, he came around that tent in such a way that I could make out his appearance a little bit better. And I have to say it was not quite what I had been expecting to see. For one thing, this dude wasn't getting close to the tent in order to look at it. He was bending down low so that he could smell our tent. And his nasal equipment, which he used to do that smelling, was not something that looked even slightly human at all. At first I thought I was looking at some sort of disgusting human anteater sucking on our tent, looking for a buggy snack. But it only took seconds for me to see that this was not some sort of proboscis protruding from the skull of the beast. This was a snout, like something a wolf or other canine might have. It snapped open and shut. It held long rows of fangs. It ended in a canine nose. It was a wolf that was walking upright like a man. Was it a werewolf? Or was it just a kind of a wolf or wild dog that walked on its hind legs? I mean, I've read that sometimes dogs and bears can injure their front legs, and then they figure out how to walk on their hind ones instead. It's either that or give up, you know? So, sometimes nature finds a way, as Jeff Goldblum is known to say. Once the upright walking anteater theory fell apart, I replaced it with the big dog walking upright because its front legs are probably injured theory. But when the animal suddenly noticed the two of us standing there staring at him, the creature grabbed a stone from the forest floor and flung it toward the dirt just in front of the trees we were hiding behind. The spinning stone bounced once on the hard dirt, then flew up into the air to slam loudly into a branch over the head of me and my friend. Leaves and twigs rained down on us. The creature man had an arm better than C.C. Sabathia or Felix Hernandez, and he knew exactly where we were. The thing about seeing the creature spin that rock at us is that it sure didn't look like his arm was injured. Both his arms looked more than healthy. They looked like some kind of steroid freak from the planet Krypton owned them. This was some kind of a dog with a human chest and muscle man arms. His paws were enough like hands to not only be able to pick up that rock, but to be able to spin it like a professional pitcher. That's not a wolf or a canine with injured front arms. That's a wolf or a canine with superior front arms. The arms of a human athlete, not the arms of a house pet. Was this possibly a real werewolf? Was this an animal that just happened to resemble the mythical Wolfman? Jerry Lee started backing away from our camp, and he pulled me from behind to bring me with him. The creature was still staring right at us, and it was now growling. I saw its eyes light up with a slightly reddish glow, and I wondered what in this scene had that much light in it. Where was he reflecting the light from? Those eyes looked more as though they were lit from within than reflecting from without. So there was some blinding lightning which crashed down into a tree about 20 feet to our right and 20 feet to the Dogman's left. The light flickered briefly 2 or 3 times, illuminating the entire scene in a bluish-white version of daylight. I saw the Dogman's fur literally standing on end, and I looked to find that Jerry Lee's hair was doing the same thing. By the time the deafening roar of the thunder hit my ears, I could see that the Dogman had turned and run away. We ran forward into our tent, planning on grabbing some stuff and leaving. But once inside there, the rains came hard and heavy. It felt like each raindrop was baseball-sized, and we both found it kind of intimidating. We decided it was better to remain under that canvas, that the Dogman was probably off looking for his own shelter by that point. It was a sleepless night, as we had no idea what might be happening next. But we both survived until morning, and that is my one and only cryptid encounters story. That's the time a decade back when my buddy Jerry and I had a rock spun at us. By the Woodstock Werewolf. We spend our lives plotting and scheming while the sun is shining and the moon is beaming. Seems to me we'd be better off dreaming once you got EPs like Sandra Freeman. Please join us and thank you today's executive producer, Sandra Freeman, for making this episode possible. Sandra is one of our elite channel members. She gets to see all our secret episodes, not to mention our over 25 hours of secret archive episodes. The Mutant Dogman. Was it natural or bred by man? Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am not a person who sees cryptids all the time, but the one incident I have to tell you is a real doozy. It happened, I guess, about 5 years ago now, and my friend who was with me has unfortunately passed away since then. I don't have any proof. I've only got this story, and as I've already hinted, it's a unique one. I have not personally found another one like it on the internet so far, and I know that won't help people want to believe me that this was something I actually lived through. If I'm the only one claiming to have seen something like this, then maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe it's my personal problem, and not something I really encountered. And yet my friend we can call Hanley lived through that same strange evening alongside me, and we were talking about writing a book on the subject when he suddenly got ill and left us too soon to write more than a few preliminary emails about how he thought the book might be laid out. I've looked over those emails before writing this one for you to adapt for your show. I'd like to keep both of us anonymous, but I haven't lived in that region of the USA since before the pandemic, and I don't think very many of the people I knew well over there have remained either. I lived there for less than half a year, same as most of the people I made friends with, and for the same reason. We all moved over there because of a job, and we all left once the company started laying a bunch of us off. I'm not sure if they completely went under or if they might survive in a smaller or a swallowed-up form, but this is a story about the brief period just before the pandemic kicked many of us in the head. Our company was still growing. Our salaries were supposed to as well in a short while, and I was granted a week vacation before I'd even worked there half a year. I didn't have a girlfriend at the time, so I was actually thinking about getting a hotel room in a certain Midwest city and putting some effort into meeting eligible young women. My work buddy Hanley talked me into going camping with him instead, saying some nonsense about how women would flock to me after I got back to nature or something like that, I don't know. If I knew half of what was going to happen in those woods with Hanley, I would have gone to the city alone, but some devil was guiding my path on that day. I don't know what there was in my karma or destiny that led me to where I was led, but I must have done something mean to someone in a former life or something. So we went to the Bray Creek State Forest Campground in Michigan, which is located in the middle of a whole lot of green. I can't honestly say I'm surprised that we saw a black bear there, but since I am not originally from the Midwest and had never heard of a Dogman before, you can take my word for it that the Dogmen were quite unexpected. And I do mean Dogmen, since what we saw was some kind of a mutant creature interacting with what Hanley called a Dogman, and what we could both see was a tall black bear. Since all three had the same black fur and the same dark gray, almost black epidermis, it was really as though there were three males of the same species arguing over the same turf. When we were able to more clearly see what was happening, however, it became apparent that there were some major differences in the physical characteristics of these beasts, more than should have been possible if they were all the same kind of creature. We saw the black bear first, and this tells you something about my late friend Hanley. He saw that bear rear up on his hind legs and walk into the woods away from us, and Hanley somehow interpreted that to mean that the bear wanted us to follow him. I had interpreted it as the black bear being intimidated by the presence of two upright walking humans, so he stood up on his back legs to show us that he was taller than we were. Hoping we were impressed, he then beat it off into the woods, again hoping that we would be too scared to follow. In my opinion, after all of that show, it was quite rude of Hanley to run after the clearly scared bear. It was also just plain stupid, since a threatened and frightened animal is always the most dangerous kind. But Hanley, for all his professed love of nature, didn't seem to understand the very first rules of real life, which are, don't interpret a threat as an invitation, and never, but never, follow a huge bipedal predator into the woods of Michigan. Once Hanley ran into the forest, I felt as though I had no choice but to follow. I'm a more experienced camper now, so I can think of any number of other things I might have done that evening, such as sending off Hanley's GPS coordinates to the authorities and going to find myself a safer place to camp. Back then, though, I was scared to be alone in the woods as it was getting dark, and that proves I already understood more about nature than my buddy from work. Once we were under the tree cover and into the woods, it was like entering a completely different world in some ways. It was darker in there. It was colder. It smelled differently in there in both better and worse ways. And everything I saw looked like it was both dead and alive at the same time. The rotting log had tendrils of young green plants growing out of it. In front of me, I could see my friend blundering along after the tall black bear, who seemed even taller now that the ceiling had dropped so much under those trees. The bear himself blundered in turn into a relative clearing. I mean to say that it was an area clear of trees, but the grasses were tall enough to entirely cover the bear's legs. I saw that Hanley was having difficulties following, as the grasses came up much higher on him. I remained a ways back on a relatively raised bit of land in the woods. I saw Hanley turning around to head back to me as I watched the bear tripping over some large object or person which I suppose had been sleeping or possibly just unconscious inside those tall grasses. Whatever that other creature was, it was large, and soon I saw the black bear rolling with what I at first took to be another, even larger, member of the same species. when both beasts separated and stood bipedally to roar at and put on intimidation displays for the other. I could see that the newer bear was some other kind of thing, some impossible creature. Its ears weren't round. Its eyes were different from how they were supposed to be. There weren't two of them. There were four, like some kind of a robot camera creature. Not really alive, but a simulated form of fake life. Part of the reason I felt that way in the moment was that the four eyes, set left to right across the face, were surrounded in a sort of metallic golden area. They really looked to me like a visor placed on the creature's head. It reminded me of these old 3D cameras they used to make, with four lenses on the front of them. And I really saw the creature as some kind of a robot, at least back then. Hanley found his way out of the grasses and to me, and we both climbed a tree to get a clearer view of the action. We both felt too close for comfort, but too far for any clear photography or video. By the time we were up in that tree, I could no longer see the black bear anywhere. It seemed to have run away. The larger creature with the golden visor was now in a series of displays intended to intimidate the new challenger. Now, this second challenger is the one that Hanley called a Dogman. That was my first time ever hearing the term, at least hearing it used to mean a monster instead of a kid's book. The amazing thing to me, as I've stated earlier, is that this Dogman had the same black fur that the gold visor mutant had, which was the same black fur that I saw on the bear that started all of this. So the entire experience had a number of illogical, surreal aspects to it. It wasn't like we felt spooky or that things had gotten weird, but we were both expressing frustration as to the illogical nature of what we were seeing. It made you feel paranoid, like, is someone putting us on? But then I saw that Hanley's clothes were covered in ticks from walking in those tall grasses, and the two of us set to work removing as many of the bugs from him as we could see. Soon it was getting too dark to see the insects, and we needed to withdraw from the woods and quickly find a safe place to set up a fire and a camp. Now, there was someone, I apologize for not remembering who, that Hanley told this story to a while after it happened and a while before he left us. That person told Hanley that they didn't think that the four-eyed monster sounded like an old 3D camera. They thought the eyes sounded like the eyes of a jumping spider. So I looked it up, and this person was actually right. The way the furthest left and right eyes are smaller, that's much closer to what I saw than the 3D cameras were. And the other thing is, that spider, his eyes are surrounded by what looks like metallic gold paint or something, doesn't it? Just like the weird mutant Dogman or bear, or whatever it was that we saw. The trouble with thinking that the Dogman we saw had the eyes of a jumping spider is that jumping spiders are tiny little creatures, while the Dogman we saw was bigger than a tall black bear. That's why, even though I no longer think that we saw a robot or cyborg or anything like that, I do still wonder if human intervention had anything to do with that bizarre four-eyed monstrosity. And to this day, I'm left asking myself the same question as I was back then. The mutant Dogman. Was it natural or bred by man? We'd like to thank our executive producer. Today she came in clutch. I'm talking about our newest member named Mrs. Topher Kutch, or Cooch. Sorry. If you would like to help us stay online in this very strange era in the internet's erratic and ever-changing history, we have a number of ways to donate and help us out. Among them is the choice to become a channel member and get to see 4 secret stories per month, in addition to our public videos that everyone can see. The booger outside of Butler met the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Back around 2009, my friends and I started seeing a Bigfoot that we called the Booger outside of Butler, because we were seeing it near Butler, Indiana, which is just this side of the Ohio border, and just that side of Michigan. I'm going to try to tell you what I remember about what my friends told me they seen, and then I'm going to finish it with my sighting, because in my experience, I didn't only see a Bigfoot, I seen a Dogman too. It was either the Michigan Dogman or a Wisconsin werewolf, venturing a little bit south of his normal habitat, or possibly it was a Lougarou or Rougarou who strayed a couple states north from his home in Louisiana. You know, not many people know this, but Ohio and Illinois are ranked 4th and 5th on the list of most Bigfoot sightings reports, and Michigan makes the top 10 as well. Being sandwiched between those places, it shouldn't surprise anyone that we get people making Sasquatch sighting reports, people making Dogman sighting reports, Sasquatches claiming to see the Dogman, and Dogman claiming Bigfoot is invading his privacy at night. Okay, I made up those last two parts, but it was kinda getting like that for a while. Now, I didn't personally see any of this till it was about to end, but my sighting was the last that anyone I know had of either cryptid, period. If people have been seeing them in that area since around 2010, those are not people that I know. So the first sighting I heard about was of a dog-headed werewolf-style Bigfoot, seen by a friend who told me to call him DJ Jazzy Jeff. This in spite of the fact that he is not a DJ, he is in no way jazzy, and I don't think anyone has ever called him Jeff or Jeffrey or anything like that. So, Jazzy was driving north on County Road 79, which is just 1 block away from the Ohio border. It's a lot of flat farmland over there, although this was late in the summer, so there may have been crops growing tall enough by then to block some parts of the view. DJ Jeff claimed that he saw plants moving in a distance. Then suddenly, a tall dark silhouette burst out from the crops onto the county road. This would have been over by that Zion church painted all white over there. Jeff stopped his car and watched as the dog-headed Bigfoot showed itself in full, running in between Jeff and the church. It was there that our jazzy friend claimed he could see the head of the creature in profile, and it looked long-snouted, with canine ears on top, like a dog or a wolf. The body was hairy and upright, like a Bigfoot, although he could not recall noticing any details concerning the legs or feet. In other words, I don't know if he had Bigfoot feet or if he had Dogman feet. And so Jeff said he was like, well, I'll be. We got dog-headed Sasquatches. And then he drove off on his way. When I first heard the story second or third hand, I was told that this happened during broad daylight. When I actually caught up with our DJ, he told me that in fact it happened as the daylight was just beginning to break, right around dawn. So he might have seen a nocturnal creature returning home. The trouble with that theory is that if you follow the direction he was running on a map, you kind of end up in a well-off suburban area. Not exactly the kind of location that you'd expect to find a small breeding population of a relic hominid. Some of us back then actually started wondering if what our friend saw was a werewolf, which sounded crazy even to us. The werewolf theory was quickly forgotten, as 2 of our other buddies had sightings of what they called Bigfoot. In both of those cases, the description was 100% within the range of normal descriptions for the appearance of Bigfoot. Neither had a wolf head, but in both cases, the creature looked like a mix between one of the great apes and a kind of a prehistoric-looking human. I'll give you a short TV guide or Reader's Digest versions of these 2 sightings. The first one happened to Mr. A, and so we'll call what he saw Bigfoot A. Now, Mr. A's sighting was not technically in Butler, Indiana, but it did sorta start there. A was with Miss A, his gal pal at the time, and the two of them began a sort of a daytime date by meeting at the International Monster Truck Museum and Hall of Fame, which, as everyone knows, is located in Butler, Indiana. I don't know if Miss A appreciated how lucky she was to be standing right there, next to some of the greatest automobile athletes and gas-powered entertainers of all time. So if she's listening, she should know that she was among chrome-plated royalty on that day. After they were done communing with monster truck and funny car gods and heroes, Mr. A took his young love for a drive about 90 minutes to the southwest, where they were going to do Mr. A's second favorite thing after staring at monster trucks, that is. And that was and is to camp out at night alone with his best girl in a dark, spooky, lonely woods. I've personally heard a number of Miss A's over the years tell both me and each other and Mr. A that the toughest part of dating Mr. A is that he likes to be in scary places with you. I actually heard two of them say it was the reason they dumped him, and a third said it was one of the reasons that made up the top 20. So, back in those innocent days of 2009, Mr. A took the then current Miss A camping on that dark night in the Salamone River State Park, or Salamone State Park Recreation Area, I can't really remember which. I know they went down to those woods to camp, and that was where they claimed they experienced someone really heavy walking around just outside. At one point, they said it pushed its hand, palm open, into their tent canvas, as if trying to understand what it was seeing and touching. Mr. A and his girlfriend saw that this guy's hand was twice the size of Mr. A's hand. After some time, whoever it was withdrew, and they could both hear and feel his thudding steps shaking the ground as he receded in the distance to the other side of the clearing. It was so quiet out there for so long that both Mr. A and Miss A had to peek out and see if the one possessing the giant palm had left or not. Almost as soon as they glanced out into the night, they both saw him. It was not a human with a huge hand. It was a fairly classic-looking Bigfoot. It was humanoid, but much larger than a typical man, and it was covered in thick animal fur instead of clothing. It had a heavy brow ridge and did not give off a vibe of being all that sophisticated. When Miss A gasped, the creature turned and glared, its eyes shining a bright red, as though lit from within. According to both of them, this was not just a gorilla. They claimed it was a man covered in hair, a huge man not wearing any clothing at all. He was ugly and scarred all over. It looked like he had been fighting brutal battles since he was at a young age. I don't know how to tell Bigfoot's age, but at that height and width, I would have to think he must have been fully grown or close to it. When the creature made an angry face and grimaced at them, they saw that its teeth looked very much like larger versions of human teeth. The 8-foot-tall monster man thundered across the clearing toward them as the two puny humans pulled back into their frail little enclosure, shivering under the approach of that hairy hulk. The beast ran right up to the tent, then stopped short just outside. Mr. A and his girlfriend held their breath as long as they could. Nothing else happened. Had the Bigfoot run up to them, then tiptoed away? Was he still waiting out there in the dark for them to slip up and stick their heads outside? They couldn't even hear the beast breathing out there, but they were too afraid to move a muscle. When dawn finally came, the two were so exhausted they lay down and had a nap before getting up to go home. Next encounter, Mr. B and Beulah. Mr. B was driving with his wife Beulah, and they told the rest of us over the course of the next month or two about their sighting, which once again was of a Bigfoot, not of a Dogman. In this case, they called the creature an astronaut Bigfoot. It wasn't wearing a helmet like Robot Monster or anything like that. They were calling it an astronaut because when it walked, it sort of took big jumps like it was in lower gravity. One time I heard them tell it to a few of us, and I heard Mr. B say that it looked like footage of monsters from old Godzilla movies, or else footage of the Apollo 11 astronauts on the moon. The next two times I was around when they were telling the story, though, both of them insisted on clarifying that they were not trying to say that the creature moved in slow motion. They were trying to explain something really weird. They said he seemed as heavy as a large beast should seem when his feet slammed hard into the ground. Once he jumped up, however, it was as though all his weight and mass evaporated, and he had somehow, suddenly, become lighter than a feather. He wasn't moving in slow motion. He was just drifting on the slightest of breezes until, ba-bam, he landed again on the hard ground, shaking the earth for a 1/16 of a mile in each direction. Once his mighty leg and foot bounced up off the hard-packed dirt, however, the creature appeared again to float like some kind of a Macy's Day balloon. Mr. B would usually wrap the story up by saying that they just sat there with their jaws slack for a few minutes after the Beastman had made his way off out of their line of vision. And then he would turn to Beulah, and she'd be like, quote, and that's when I started ragging on him for not getting any pictures, unquote. Okay, now let's go to my sighting, the Mongo monsters from the Mongo Mill Pond. Now, all of those stories happened in 2009, but the next one was the one I had, and this was in the late spring or early summer of 2010. This was the most incredible of all the monster experiences of that 10 or 11 month period, because this one involved two different kinds of Midwest monster. Both the Bigfoot kind with the big wide human feet, as well as the upright werewolf sort of beastman that doesn't officially exist. My girlfriend back then used to say that we got the 2-for-1 special. So over by Mongo, which is up north in the state, not far from Michigan, they've got natural areas and places you can camp or whatever. My then girlfriend, who I'm going to go ahead and call Blongo, and I decided to pack a picnic lunch and head over to the Mongo Mill Pond one day, right near the Pigeon River Fish and Wildlife area. We hadn't really planned much out ahead. We just figured we'd wander around till we got hungry, then we'd eat our sandwiches and split. It was while we were eating that our meal was interrupted by not one, but two upright, sloppy-looking, mud and garbage-covered cryptid man things. Neither of us heard them coming, until suddenly they were like 10 feet away, crashing up out of the mill pond, splashing mud and water everywhere, into our food, and speckling it all over us. Each creature was uttering a different kind of pained sound, which let you know they were hurting, and they were beyond their usual level of enduring hurt, and that they saw no clear end to the battle they were engaged in. Both man-things were too tall to be men, but I don't mean they were 15 feet tall. I mean they were probably around 8 feet each, though. Remember, I'm talking about them up on their hind legs. They were each trying to grab the other and throw him to the ground, but they were both too slippery, covered in that slimy wet bottom of the mill pond, to be grabbed or held with very much authority. Now, I don't know what they were fighting about, although I could tell they had come from the Mongo Mill Pond. I didn't know why. I only know, for an absolute fact, that one of these was the wolf-headed creature I had heard described before, and the other one was a more traditional Sasquatch. They tore off after each other, and we packed up to get the heck out of that area before the creatures came back. As I've said before, this encounter caused a little bit of a hubbub when it happened, but it also marked the end of this monster flap or grouping of monster sightings. Nobody I knew saw any more monsters in Indiana again in 2010 or in any of the years since. At least, they haven't shared the story with me if they have. Now, in the dozen years since that sighting, I began to hear more and more about the Dogman, and I always got amazed that I had seen one before they were famous. Of course, when I looked into it a little bit deeper, I found out people have been telling stories of the Midwest Dogman for 100 years. I'm not sure what year things shifted, but now it seems more people tell me about the Dogman than tell me about the Bigfoot. I mean, Indiana was never the state most famous for cryptid sightings, but we've gotten dozens and dozens of reports coming from here over the years. I don't honestly know what makes two creatures over into sworn enemies. That would be like asking why Red Sox fans hate Yankee fans. They're both from the Northeast, so I used to just figure that the answer was that everybody's crazy on the East Coast. But when I saw that big old Dogman and that bigger-than-you-figure Bigfoot beating on each other like it really mattered, I sort of came to understand that there are just some things I'm never going to understand. If the Dogman and the Bigfoot just allowed each other to live and let live, there would probably be enough roadkill and whatnot for both to subsist on. Why, the energy they used up in the part of the fight that we viewed would take eating half a deer to replenish. You would think that the wisdom of nature would prevail, allowing these two beasts to coexist alongside each other, sharing resources and saving their energy for emergencies. That, however, is not nature's way. Nature's way is the savage way. Nature says there will be one predator, and one predator alone, who shall rule this land. Everyone else will take second or third place or lower under the true king of the temperate jungles of the North American continent. I don't know how long this evolutionary struggle will rage on, but I do think I know who will eventually win. When the Bigfoot could not grab the Dogman, the canine slipped out of his grasp. When the Dogman found the Bigfoot too slippery, however, he pulled out his fish-hook-like claws and began scoring bloody point after bloody point in the battle as the two immense beasts raced away from us. The Dogman's claws are not like your pet Fido's claws. They're something more like the claws of a lion or tiger. Or possibly a better comparison would be to say that they're like your cat's claws, but much, much larger and far more lethal. Anyone who spent any time around a cat that was flipping out over something knows that even a little kitty can become seriously dangerous when they start acting like idiots. If you only end up with a few scratches on your hands, you're lucky. You could end up like Nick Fury in that bad superhero movie, whatever it was called. That's why he wears the eye patch. Disney should have a Marvel Comics soap opera called As Stan Lee Turns in his grave. Let's get real before I let you go. The Bigfoot can make a fist. The Bigfoot can punch with that fist. The Bigfoot can yell a lot, and he's pretty freaking scary to be anywhere in the vicinity of. The Bigfoot does not, however, have jaws strong enough to bite off your car's bumper and little deadly Ginsu knives at the ends of each of his fingers. The Bigfoot also is known to kill what he needs to survive. The Dogman, on the other hand, will kill more than he needs. And then, he'll steal food away from other animals in his area on top of that. This is how I think they've taken over so fast. They don't just take the lion's share of the food and resources for themselves in their insane rages. They then begin taking away the smaller bits that are left. Can even the legendary Bigfoot survive such a drastic change in the ecology of the American wilderness? Or are we really talking about the permanent end of the Bigfoot era in world history when we're talking about incidents Like the time when the booger outside of Butler met the Dogman. The angels sing, their trumpets herald today's EP named Rashawn Gerald. Please join me in welcoming Rashawn Gerald to our channel members. Without donations, merch purchases, and both PayPal and channel memberships, we literally could not survive much longer here on the internet. I'm not sure how many of you understand how literally I mean that. Dogman, on the way to worship. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a Dogman story for you that involves one of the creatures trying to prevent my wife and daughter from attending church on Sunday. I don't know if he was doing it to try to catch and eat them for food, or if he was just doing it to be evil. It certainly seems that there are a lot of people who do things for no other reason except to be evil lately. So it shouldn't surprise me if animals began behaving in this way as well. As you have requested, I have separated the ending of the story out, as it is somewhat violent. You can use that one for a members-only show, I don't care. As long as you stick to my facts and keep this all anonymous, I'm fine with the rest of your choices. So I'm about to tell you a story about the Pennsylvania Dogman, but I have to first get through this other nastiness, which is the reason our parish shut down and we moved. Some of the rest of the congregation told me they were done with being publicly religious, as it only drew harassment from those violent gangs. What are they called again? The fascist aunties? Something like that? They called us terrible things, and now there is no more church in that old area. Now the only thing left considered divine in that part of the country is the government. Gee, I wonder who that benefits. You can think on that particular question for yourself while I tell you this little tale. So one Sunday, my wife and daughter came back from church very distraught, saying they had been chased home by bullies who insulted them because of their religious faith. My daughter was bawling, saying the people told them that our family isn't wanted and that we should move out while we still could. When I think of the men and women who fought and died for generations to preserve religious liberty in the United States, and then I see these bullies working hard to end any kind of freedom at all, using violence and cowardly tactics, the same as bullies usually use, well, it gets my blood boiling. So that week, I traded shifts with someone else at my job to free the early half of Sunday. That allowed me the time to walk my family to and from church and see to it that they were not harassed as they exercised their First Amendment right to freedom of religion. Only on that particular morning, the harassment came from an entirely non-human sort of a bully. That was the first morning that our family saw the Dogman. I decided that I would walk my family through the woods, taking a shortcut known to very few of the locals. I was hoping that since those bullies that were bothering us seemed to be bussing in from out of town, that they might not know about our local secret shortcuts. We didn't encounter any human bullies that morning, but we did come across a two-legged, upright version of Old Black Shuck from the ancient British legend. The original Shuck was said to have shown up in a church during a wild thunderstorm, running up and down the aisles of the church on his four legs, leaving parishioners dead in his canine wake. In the darkness ahead of us, we saw two glowing eyes, each of them placed well taller than my head, and I was the tallest of my family. I knew it was an animal, since humans don't have eyes shine like that. But I hoped it might just be a small owl up on a branch, not a bipedal creature standing literally 7 feet tall, or taller. I kept hoping I'd see it flap its wings and fly away, but the eyes remained where they were, and I could increasingly see, as my eyes adjusted to the light, that where they were was on top of two very broad and human-like shoulders. "Bigfoot," whispered my wife, and it was the exact same thing I was thinking too. But that made no sense, since we both knew that we were there looking at the Pennsylvania Dogman. We knew we were seeing a bipedal werewolf, so why did both of us think of Bigfoot when the werewolf stood there looking at us? Maybe it was just the size of the thing, which was way taller than any human I'd ever seen. Like in the movies. I don't remember any basketball player-sized wolfmen. Do you? They usually seem to be the same size as most of the other men in those films. This one was big, huge, immense. It was not like any ordinary guy running around on his tiptoes. He looked like some kind of a dog or a wolf hybrid that had been bred to walk upright, as naturally as human beings do it. He looked to me like an elite super soldier deep undercover, or else he looked to me like some guy afflicted with lycanthropy and gigantism at the same time. It was really scary being so close to that out of control, clearly frightened predator. And while this was happening, I remember being gripped by a bizarre and all-encompassing sense of sadness as I watched my life play out in front of me, in between the live action happening in that moment. Every single time I made a decision in my life that I later regretted or questioned, I was cringing through a replay of that moment, sometimes presented from multiple angles somehow. Every decision seemed like a complete failure to me then, because they had all led to me and my family facing this flailing wild man-beast. I grabbed both members of my family by the hand, and we tore off the path into the woods themselves. I knew that cement sidewalks and suburban streets were on the other side of those trees, and I was gambling that the Dogman wasn't willing to follow us out there into suburbia. Well, he wasn't. Not then, anyway. In fact, I'm not sure how far he even followed us. We did not see him again that day. The next Sunday, we organized the neighbors with the larger vehicles to make the rounds and pick everybody up to bring them to church. Meanwhile, me and some of the other dads went into those dark woods that morning. And this is where the story got very violent. Hey everybody, Bigfoot here. This is where we need to cut it off, but we do have a conclusion for our channel members and our PayPal Club members. It should hopefully be up right now. So PayPal Club members, check your emails for the URL, and channel members, check your notification page. If you aren't a channel member yet, we give you 4 secret Dogman stories a month that nobody else gets to hear. Oh, and we all owe a debt of thanks to today's executive producer, Valerie Gomez, aka Nicole Gomez, who I think was also executive producer of our last episode too. Valerie became a channel member again last time and has donated to us using our super thanks button located under this and all of our videos this time. It's the YouTube equivalent of our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 direct donation link. Some people refuse to use this or that. I can understand. I might branch out to 1 or 2 more ways to donate. I just don't want to get too confusing. But now it's time for a guy who always keeps it simple. Here comes our international TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman to break it down and make it as easy to swallow as Alpo. Hank? Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.